Well, it's a great day today. We are moving into a new book. We've been in Ezekiel for such a long time. Our reward is to move into the book of Daniel, a relatively short book, just 12 chapters, and a book that I was going to say it's one of my favorite books in the Bible, but I think whatever book I happen to be in is my favorite book in the Bible, it seems. But Daniel is just really great. He's the last of the major prophets, the last book we'll be reading this year. I like the way one theologian summarizes the message of the book as the God who protects, discloses, and rules. And that's really what we see here is God protecting, disclosing, and ruling the earth and Israel in this book. It's a really an important book for prophecy. It lays out the succession of empires that the world is going to experience from the time of Daniel to the end of history. And the book of Revelation, which we may cover next year. If you have some ideas on what you'd like to cover, let me know. Send me an email. My email address is in the notes below. But anyway, the book of Revelation looks at kind of the same succession of history, but from the perspective of John, who is at the end. So it's a nice bookend and the prophecy of the Bible. In this first chapter, we're going to learn kind of the beginnings and the length of Daniel's prophetic career. I've called this Daniel's personal story. So that's really what's being laid out here is Daniel's personal history. The outline for the book is talks about Daniel's deportation to Babylon in verses 1 through 7, and then an important decision that Daniel is forced to make, really, in verses 8 through 16. And then the chapter ends in 17 through 21, talking about the duration of Daniel's ministry. So I was able to alliterate it this time, deportation, decision, and duration. Daniel chapter 1. So let's dig in a little bit here as you read through this chapter today. Verse 1, the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. This is the year 605, is what that works out to. And this is the first of three deportation of the Jews. We've talked about this in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel as well. There was a deportation in 605, another in 597, and a final in 586 was the last one, which resulted in the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. I want you to note carefully in verse 2 there that it's the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, Nebuchadnezzar's, hand. Lord, in my NASB Bible, perhaps in your Bible as well, is spelled with lower caps, which means that behind that word is the Hebrew tetragrammaton. It's called the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh. So it's making it very clear here that Israel's God, the covenant father, the covenant God, Yahweh, caused this exile. So right at the beginning of the book, it's making it known that God is at work in history. He's working within geopolitical history. If Fox News or CNN were around back in 605, this would be front and center on every newscast, the invasion of Israel by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Look at verse 2 as well. It talks about bringing some of the vessels from the house of God to the land of Shinar. Well, in Israel, there was a restriction against having an image or likeness of Yahweh. So they couldn't bring an idol of Yahweh from Jerusalem to Babylon. So they brought some of the vessels used in his worship. So that's the best they could do. These vessels are going to show up again in chapter 5 of Daniel. But for now, we need just to know that having no idol to bring into his temple, he brings in these instruments of worship. I think what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here is he's showing his domination over even the God of Israel by bringing these instruments of worship into his temple. And it's perhaps the temple of Nebo, which is where his name comes from, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebo was the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. He's mentioned only in the Bible once, actually, in verse 46, or chapter 46, verse 1 of Isaiah. Verses 3 through 7, we see some of the Babylonian foreign policy. They take the best and the brightest from Israel, and their plan is to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. This, incidentally, is kind of the beginning of the loss of the Hebrew language. Later, when Israel returns to the land and Ezra is reading the law for them or having the law read before them, he has to include people who, what they say, interpret the law or translate it from Hebrew into Aramaic. And even during Jesus' time, the predominant language among Jews besides Greek was Aramaic. So this is the beginning of the loss of their knowledge of the Hebrew language, which really was, in modern times, just recovered during the Reformation, the 1550s or so. So as we go through the next section, beginning in verse 8 of chapter 1, Daniel decides that he's going to resist the civil authority, and he refused to eat and drink what the king's providing. You'll see that in this section. I don't think it's so much as to keep kosher, because he's not insisting on kosher food here. He's just insisting on vegetables and water. I think what he's trying not to do is eat foods that are offered to the Babylonian gods. This would have been kind of a participation in the worship of those gods and a participation in this effort to assimilate. So Daniel's being very careful here, and he's drawing a line. He's drawing a line that he is not going to participate in the worship of these gods. Verse 9, we see God again. We see throughout the book of Daniel, God shows up in various ways. God again in verse 9 here. And although Daniel and his companions, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, are away from the land and away from the temple, God has not forgotten them. He's showing he's not just a local deity. He's the God of the whole world. And he's taking care of them while they're in captivity, which you could imagine for those who are reading this in Daniel's day, this would be a great comfort for those who think that Yahweh has abandoned them in their exile. Daniel's in a position that many of us are in. We are called aliens and strangers scattered over the earth at the beginning of 1 Peter. That's kind of our situation and what Daniel's situation as well. He's an alien and he's a stranger. But note in verses 10 through 14 how careful, how respectful, deferential even Daniel is in his interaction with the commander of the officials and the overseers. So he's being very polite, we'd say, careful in his dealings with these men. He's not getting in their face and asserting his rights, but reasoning with them. Verses 15 and 16, we see the result of Daniel and his companions not eating the food given to the idols, is that their appearance seemed better and they were fatter, and fatter in their culture would be healthier than all the others. This isn't due to so-called Daniel diet. I know that's really popular or has been popular in the past. That's not what this is about. It's about God. It's about the fact that on rations of vegetables and water, Daniel and his companions would have expected to kind of wane, especially in comparison to those who live in large and eating at the king's table. But instead, it's God who causes them to thrive here. It's God who causes them to prosper. And that's the idea here, is God shows up, God intervenes, God's taking care of his people, even though they're in exile. Verses 17 through 21, we see the duration highlighted here of Daniel's ministry. Verses 17 through 20, we learn that Daniel and his companions thrived. God enabled them to excel in everything they did, learning pagan culture. Daniel's gifted, particularly in visions and dreams, understanding them, which will be important later. In verses 18 and 19, God even granted Daniel and his companions with what he calls special, or we would call personal service to Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, they're in daily contact with him. So this is the most powerful man on the face of the earth. And these prophets of God, these young men, Daniel's in his teens at this point, about 17. Daniel is in daily contact with him. And this is God's plan for them, God's blessing. And Daniel continued to serve at the very highest level of the most powerful nations on earth from 605 to 539 BC. That's what it means when it says in verse 21, he continued until the first year of Cyrus. That's 66 years. And then in chapter 10, verse 1, we learn that he's also serving later, not just during the first year, but later, as late as 536. So Daniel began this work in the highest levels of pagan nation when he was about 17, and he ends when he's about 86. During this time, Daniel witnesses history up close and personal. He sees Babylon replace Egypt as the dominant world power. In Israel in about 601, Jehoiakim is going to rebel against Babylonian rule while Daniel is advising the king. So must have been a very interesting, very difficult situation for Daniel while his home country, his ruler of Israel is rebelling. Daniel is advising the king. Many people would conclude that he's a traitor. But what Daniel is doing is being faithful to God. A few years after that second exile in 597, Zedekiah again allies with Egypt to try to resist Babylon and attempts another revolt. And there we have Nebuchadnezzar bringing a final crushing defeat to Israel while Daniel is serving him. Again, very difficult situation for Daniel. Some would look at him again as a traitor, a turncoat, a Benedict Arnold, we'd call him in the United States. But Daniel is faithfully serving God in this position. So in terms of application, I'd say that one of the things we can learn from this is that even the righteous, Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, even the righteous suffer when there's rebellion and apostasy. And like Daniel, I think, and his companions, we're challenged to remain faithful right now during our time of exile. I think sometimes people may look at us as perhaps traitors when we are not agreeing with them on their political decisions or their political views. But we're called to be faithful not to a party or not to a particular party's leader, but we are called to be faithful to God. And that sometimes, and maybe even often, requires us to be at odds with popular opinion. I'd also point out that circumspection, which means being wary and risk averse, circumspection, respect, and wisdom enabled Daniel to remain faithful in the face of the pressure of cultural assimilation. And I think we also need to be, as Jesus said, shrewd as serpent and innocent as doves, as we live among sheep, as we live as sheep among wolves. That's what Jesus said in Matthew 10:16. And in the times that we live, we find that even wolves have made their way into the church. Refer to Acts 20, verses 29 and 30, for example. So we need to be doubly on guard against being conformed to those around us, but instead being careful to be faithful to God. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and may you also be circumspect, respectful, and wise as we live as shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves.